Hi, everybody who's coming in. Welcome. We'll probably just awkwardly hang out for just a moment. Which for me is just hanging out. I don't do anything any other way. So. What do y'all think? Should we give it like another 2 minutes, 1 minute?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, super. Super good group. I love being able to scroll through the attendees. Hi, everybody. I wish I had some witty banter. What's everybody drinking? Are you all drinking coffee at the moment? That's like the classic vamping while people arrive.
I have water.
Water now.
I need to wet my whistle.
We're just getting ready to talk.
I'm gonna get some water.
Oh, I'm drinking coffee, dude. Am I the only one?
What do you have?
It's a honey processed coffee from Lake Toba in Sumatra, roasted by my best buddy, Juliet Hahn at UC Davis.
All right.
Right on.
You're showing
I have
us
a little bit of Guatemala Antigua Bellavista. Bellavista farm, fully washed, delicious. A classic.
How about you, Jen? Are you drinking any coffee?
Yeah, I am. I'm drinking Guatemala that I roasted. And next I'm going to make another pot of Ethiopian, fresh Ethiopian, which is so delicious.
We're ready for the season.
So excited. I've been making my labels, so got to get those out to the printer. Next week, everyone gets fresh Ethiopian coffee. Oh, such a good time.
I should mention I just finished Jen's coffee at home.
Oh, the Burundi?
Yeah, which we love.
Yeah. I've got another one of her coffees that I just sample roasted yesterday. And from that, the IWCA project that coffee's from, this is like a group of women who, from that project, they bought their own wet mill. And so now I have one of their first like harvest from the wet mill. Super cool. So like I want to call it like owning the means of production or something, like literally, you know, just rad. Yeah. Like I make a label for that one too. It's a fun time in coffee for sure. Delicious, fun.
That's awesome. Cool. I'm not ashamed to say that before this, I had a cup of decaf. Just trying to
old Meister.
The old heart rate, you know. I'm so excited to see you all, and so I needed to manage my blood pressure.
You're barely doing that, Meister.
Yes.
You look like you're gonna pop.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so excited, and I feel like now that we've reached 40 attendees, I feel like we can go. What do you think?
I agree.
The consent of the panel, awesome. Okay, well, welcome in everybody. Hello, welcome to this edition of the Summer Salon Series. It's hosted by the Partnership for Gender Equity and sponsored by Roast Magazine. Today's topic is reimagining equitable sourcing. We have, as you can see, as we've been chatting, we have the most amazing lineup of coffee luminaries. I hope you don't mind me calling you that. We've got Al Liu of Colectivo Coffee, Shauna Alexander from Stumptown, Jen Apodaca from Mother Tongue and from the Roasters Guild and Pulley Collective, the Hat Trick. Charlie Habegger from Royal Coffee, and of course, Kimberly Easson from the Partnership for Gender Equity. Me, I'm Meister from Cafe Imports, and I promise I'm not going to do all the talking. I'm just a moderator. So just to introduce the topic of the salon and then to ask some questions and get the conversation going, we just want to say that, like, it's already a cliche to say these times we're living in, right? But that's exactly what we want to come together and discuss, namely how the current climate in the world, as well as in specialty coffee, has been changing and shaping and challenging and hopefully inspiring some progress, right, in the coffee industry. We're working toward transparency, sustainability, and equity. Many of us in the sector have been seeking for years. So in this salon, we're going to discuss how a cross-section of industry leaders, that's you all, are finding ways to stay connected to their values and even use this opportunity to reflect and grow toward a more equitable coffee universe. So since it's a salon, I want you all to feel comfortable jumping in, asking each other questions, following up on each other's thoughts. You know, this is just a conversation. It's not going to be, I don't want it to be like a bunch of talking heads. It's always a little bit strange to do these things over Zoom, but let's imagine we're all in the same, I don't know, the same living room, the same cafe. And the same thing goes for, oh, go ahead.
I wish we were, right?
I
Next
wish we
time.
were too. Yeah, in 6 to 8 months, maybe. And the same thing goes for everyone in the audience, so to speak. There's a chat window, there's a Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we'll get to them toward the end of the conversation, or if it fits the topic at hand, maybe we'll shove it in there. This is a little bit anything goes because it's coffee and we're coffee people. So you can't really hold us back. Does that sound okay for everybody?
Love it.
Okay, awesome. So the first thing that I want to ask is a personal question, not too personal, but just personal enough. And I want to know, how have you changed? How has your company changed? What is happening for you since, not only since COVID, but also since all of the increased attention and awareness and real activism and motivation around racial equity? Like, how have the various things that we've been dealing with in 2020 so far affected you in your business? Shauna, your face.
Surprise.
I'm gonna pick on you first. Yeah, surprise opener.
Well, don't make me cry. I mean, it's affected
Yeah.
everything. It's affected everything. And so, I mean, as a person, I mean, you asked it on a couple levels. You asked it as a human, and then you asked it kind of as a company. So as a human, like, to witness or be part of so many massive changes on every level, seeing so many people go through massive personal impacts, personal changes, seeing companies, friends, our community change in so many ways. It's been dizzying, and it's also been very emotional. And yeah, there've been a lot of changes, you know, in the company too. And it's been very, very difficult. It's been very, very difficult. So I think that almost goes without saying that it's been really difficult, but you said, I think either while we were going live or before we went live, like being able to focus, like staying focused, like staying grounded, like that's like an exercise every day.
Yeah, for me personally, I mean, my like COVID story in coffee began sort of at the beginning of shelter in place. I was working outside of the industry for the last year and a half, And, you know, my position at Royal really didn't happen until it was literally 5 days before shelter in place hit where I was living in Mendocino County, that Royal and I worked out the position together. And, you know, personally, I feel extremely fortunate, not just to be where I am with the team, you know, that I get to work with, but also to not have had that opportunity compromised, you know, by everything that was happening. I feel definitely like one of the survivors in that way. But what I can say is, like, I'm originally from the Bay Area, and when I left, I was working for Blue Bottle, which is like a very embedded Bay Area coffee roaster. And so I was, you know, to me, the Bay Area has always been this like thriving coffee place with thriving individuals in coffee that for me was always a kind of energy source. So for me to move back during shelter in place and like move, you know, back into our house, but not be able to go anywhere, and just like kind of coming back to the Bay Area and seeing it as almost like a wasteland because everything was closed all of a sudden, it's really jarring. But I have to say, my experience working within a coffee organization during COVID in the Bay Area, like, I have seen how much resilience is required and how creative solutions are very personal, right? And are internal by teams. So and just from being able to connect with people that I've always been close with, I know that there is a form of creativity that is very internal to coffee businesses now. Everyone has to sort of deal with this on a community level. I think that goes, you know, without saying that, like, in the United States, at least, where we don't have a comprehensive like healthcare system that can sort of fight the disease on behalf of the people, like, it's really been community by community to do what they can. And I think within really large global industries like coffee, there's a mirror effect there where businesses have to figure out how they can move forward, you know. And working for an importer in particular, where we have a lot of customers who have been really close to Royal's business for, in some cases, many decades, there are a lot of individual stories of resilience within coffee. And that's a really big source of like energy for me. And I know for the rest of us at Royal, even though you can't really validate it by going to cafes all the time and kind of seeing it with your own eyes, or like going to Rico in person this year, for example. But I do sort of trust that's out there, you know, and those are the stories that we hear. So definitely interesting times, but I think it has been a period where people are really looking within their communities to find the best solutions they can.
Yeah, that's awesome. The pendulum between hope and despair, it can be very exhausting, but at the same time, if you don't have the one, it's very hard to have the other. Like, creative solutions are only possible as the result of unique situations or unexpected situations. So that's a really nice perspective. I like that.
Meister, your question, I have to write it down so I remember what the questions are, you know, because short-term memory of getting older. Anyway, you know, you asked like how things changed, and you specifically asked about like racial equity, which I thought was really great. And I also really took in what Shauna said too about, like, you know, the like her human side, and then the company thinking about, you know, like, you know, yeah, like when I look at how things have changed for racial equity, for me, it's really strange. It's not like I just started thinking about it. Like like, you know, I'm 42 now. So, I mean, I graduated college like 20 years ago, right? So, but in college, like, I was an activist. I studied sociology. I took race, class, and gender courses. I read books about intersectionality, like Patricia Hill Collins' book was like influential in like the way that I think about people and the way that I approach people. And I think that, like, so it's like I've already been thinking about these things anyway. And I myself am biracial. I am white and Mexican. My mom's white, my dad's Mexican. So I've always sort of paid attention to those differences. I've always noticed that both sides of my family have, to a degree, anti-Black sentiments, and trying to like understand that without, you know, any education or help, and not even being able to talk to anybody about it really, but like noticing things, or like knowing that things were weird or strange. I think that for someone like me, this isn't the first time I've been thinking about these things. I mean, I used to go to anti-police brutality, like October 22nd is anti-police brutality protests in the Bay Area since I started going to them in like 1997, right? So like, I've always known about things, but it's never had a big voice. And it seems like it has a really big voice right now. And I think that that is fantastic, that it has a large voice. Being like this anarchist when I got hired into management, like, and I was in charge of hiring, I felt really strange. I was like, oh God, I'm that person. I hate that person. Why am I that person, you know? But there's something really good about being that person. And the good thing about being that person is that you are in charge of hiring. You're a gatekeeper and you can bring people in. And when people apply for jobs, we had lots of conversations. We noticed like who would apply when we have application, or we'd have job descriptions posted, and then we'd expect to get all these applications from like a diverse crowd across like race and gender, and like not see a very diverse set of applicants, you know, like what can we change to see more, or like inquire with certain people that were internal, that like, I mean, this one time I wrote a job description specifically for a person thinking that they would apply, and then they didn't. And they were like, well, you know, you asked for like 10 things for this job and I fit 7 of them, but not the other 3. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, like another person only had 1 of the 10 and they applied and they thought they would be great for the job, you know. But one of the things that I was able to do at my tenure with Blue Bottle was, I had like an all-female management team. So, and not all white and not all straight. And so that was really fantastic. And it was a part of me that I could make a difference. And the other part of making that difference is you can hire people, because part of hiring, it doesn't matter if you have all of the skills in the world, and no matter when you start a new job, like, you know, you have to learn the ropes of the new company anyway. You're still going to undergo training. Like, sure, you know how to do invoicing, but have you ever used NetSuite, or have you ever used this program? Like, you still have to figure it out. You got to figure out how all of the different like forms of communication. So I feel like sometimes people think that like expertise trumps everything when they hire. And I really think that there's a lot of on-the-job training, and a lot of us maybe have, you know, faked it and said that we knew how to do a job, knowing that there's on-the-job training, knowing that we have this beautiful grace period of 3 months to figure out what the hell we just got hired for. So I just think that, I don't know, I hope that, I don't know, I felt like right now I have this very small business where I'm not going to hire anybody because I don't have any money. But the one thing I can do at Pulley is give people access to like roasting machines, and we have lots of coffee, and I've been doing a lot of people have reached out just for basic questions about, you know, having a coffee business or starting businesses and what can they do, and nobody seems to be answering their questions. And it is true that a lot of people that have reached out have been like Black people that are trying to get into coffee. But not only are they, like, some are reaching out, but some aren't reaching out. And I realize that it's my job to reach out to see if they need help, not necessarily have them ask me, because they don't know me. And I can be, you know, like, I am somebody that they don't know, I could just refuse them. But when I reach out and say, hey, how you doing? I saw your website. Looks like you're doing cool stuff. If you ever have any questions, like, feel free to ask. And it's always a yes. So I feel like there's lots of conversations out there, a lot of opportunities for people.
If I can take what Jen was saying about hiring and also sort of connected to the theme of this salon, equitable sourcing, you know, what recent events regarding race have done for us as a company, and for me personally, to even just think about it this way. We talk about sourcing in our industry, and you know, it just automatically goes to sourcing coffee, green coffee. I think we should also look at sourcing, think about sourcing in terms of human resources. We are a roaster retailer with 21 stores, and what recent events have done have been to force us essentially to talk about things that we knew were issues, we had discussed them before, but to really be serious about them and to not just talk about them, but do something about them. And I think if we think of our own employees and staff as resources, human resources, how can we make that more equitable? So equitable sourcing goes in both directions, to origin and also within our own communities, the communities that we draw from for our own businesses. So for me, that's been something that I've been thinking about and part of the conversation in that, you know, we need to, especially in a city like Milwaukee, which is often cited as the most segregated city in the US. This is something that we needed to work on. We had been talking about it, but now it's like, okay, this is when we need to do something.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Al, because I think, you know, for the last like 7 years or so since I was working as a full-time buyer and traveling full-time and representing this kind of knowledge that in specialty is considered like so valuable, you know, not just for marketing reasons, but for like aspiring young professionals. It's like at a lot of roasting companies, the buyer is almost like a mythical kind of position. It's like the source of all this knowledge, right? I always felt like that was extremely problematic. And something that I'm really interested in, you know, is, and this goes back to when I was, you know, the sole coffee buyer at a very high growth roasting company that by the time I left had over 1,000 people, and about 90% of them were retail employees. Like, if you consider that sort of imbalance of information, like it's pretty staggering, right? And something that I'm really interested in is not, well, I should say it's not how coffee is sourced, because that's extremely important, but it's in addition to how coffee is sourced, it's who is doing the sourcing. You know, I think, so specialty coffee, I've been working since 2008, and I remember the first years of my education, looking back on it, it was very sort of neoliberal. It was like, okay, there are these competitions, the best win and the best get the price, and then only the best roasters get the best coffees, and the best stores and the best baristas, and the best baristas get the equipment, and so on and so on. And it was this cycle of competitiveness. And I think whenever you're going to draw a competition within an industry, you have to consider who is being given the tools to compete effectively, right? And I think it's equal on the producer side as it is on the consumer side. And this is something that I want to give major props to the barista community in the United States for figuring out how to talk about access to coffee. I think that, frankly, it sets an example for the rest of the supply chain. I think that a shift in the recognition of the barista within the barista community, what I've seen in the last like 5-6 years, has really gone from like, who are the best individuals, like who's the elite class that we should all look to for knowledge, and it's become more about like who's making the best community. And I think sourcing is in a way, it's like that last sort of frontier where community needs to replace the individual, because frankly, sourcing jobs at companies, it's like the bigger you get, the more risk there is, right? The higher the stakes for the business. If you are a lower margin roaster, like if you have a really large wholesale program, if you're primarily a grocery coffee roaster, you can't necessarily afford that many mistakes. You can't necessarily afford to sort of take a swing at a really high priced coffee if you're not guaranteed that you're going to sell all of it. Like, so there, because it's such a high risk position, it historically has been sort of condensed onto a single person, right? And I think over time, as specialty is developed, that person gets credit for being almost like a guru kind of character, because access is so difficult, right? So the person there must be extremely special. I remember this is something that, you know, I started fighting pretty openly when I was working at Blue Bottle. Like, look, I don't want these coffee stories to include me. It's not me and what I'm doing, you know, it's about the coffees and how they exist in the first place. All I'm doing is fighting for their representation, you know, in our roasting business. So I've seen so much progress in that shift, you know, at the barista level, which is really like our Western labor class of coffee, right? Like if baristas are the farm workers of the consuming world, then it's like they figured out how to have a conversation about inclusivity. And I think that needs to sort of trickle up in a lot of roasting businesses. And that's something that I'm really excited to see more of. I hope we get there.
I love the link between accessibility equaling equity in many ways. Like, who is part of this community? How do you get entrance? How do you get access to tools and to information and to resources? And so equally, Charlie, as you're pointing out with the barista community and all the things that we see here on our consuming side, what is happening on the ground? And you know, hearkening to the Partnership for Gender Equity and the question of gender equity and inclusion in coffee farming communities and households, and really how do we make sure that there is that access? And so often, I think for many of us, we've seen, or it's like we're peeling back layers of an onion, right? Like at first, we used to think that coffee was only about you know, it came from a place in the United States. It was French, so it was French roast, or French roast is French, or Italian roast, and it was Italian. But now we know, you know, coffee comes from Brazil. Coffee comes from these really amazing places around the world. And at the same time, too, like, it isn't just Juan Valdez as the farmer, right? Coffee is not a man's business. Coffee is a family business. And how can we really make sure that we're not only connecting with that head of household, who traditionally is the male figure, but really making sure that we're including the ideas, the perspective, and creating opportunities for other people in those households and in those communities who may not typically have access. And that doesn't only include gender, of course, it includes other vulnerable and marginalized populations. Of course, there's racism in other parts of the world where we do business. You've got, you know, indigenous folks that are indigenous people in communities that are traditionally marginalized, and also the Afro communities in many parts of Latin America that are marginalized. And so, you know, how do we start to look at differently also in our sourcing conversation this more equitable approach?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Meister.
Oh, please, Shauna, go ahead.
I think something that's related, I wanted to pick it up from what Charlie was saying in terms of this, like the mythology that gets developed around or has been cultivated around being the buyer. And that there's kind of this mystique, or there has been, and I think it's intentionally cultivated by some for sure. And that, you know, I just wanted to call that out for its, you know, not just the ego that's in that, but also that's like a colonialist mythology. Like, I'm going to go discover these coffees, you know, and I'm the hero because I found this coffee. And you're like, you didn't find it. There are people growing it, like they planted it, like, you know, like it's not your discovery, and you're not the rock star, you know, you're a partner in bringing this coffee to customers. And that's not, like, I think that is a a very old and tired persona that needs to be retired. It's just not, I think there's too much embedded in it. And that's definitely been part of, I mean, I think a lot of, even in our website, which needs to be updated desperately, there's still language about that, about like how far you have to travel and how, where you have to go, and, you know, how these, you know, distant lands. And I just think it's a disrespectful way of talking about origin partners. It's a disrespectful way of talking about the communities and the people who are fourth and fifth generation professionals. And I like to see an unwinding of that, of how we talk about sourcing, because I think in the language is embedded a lot is embedded in the language that we use. And so, and that opens up, Kimberly, to your point, like when you shift, when the thinking gets shifted and the discourse gets shifted around how we talk about how we source and how we partner, then you can really think of partnering in a different way, in the ways that you might think of partnering with your own communities, in your own, you know, in your own neighborhoods, or in your own, in the areas where you operate. And that's where I think that mindset shift, undoing mindsets is tricky, but delving in is the most important thing to do, kind of on a personal level. When you start to unwind that, you see how much of these weird kind of colonialist mindsets and legacies are woven in everywhere, from like the projects that people do. And you're like, you know, you wouldn't roll into like your neighboring town, or, you know, or go to France and be like, hey, we're going to put a park in here. We're going to put in a well, and be like, you don't just roll in and assume that people want this because you want to put it in your sustainability report, you know, like, no, like it is, when you start to undo a lot of this, and there's been a lot of work done on this. I mean, Poverty Inc. is a great documentary, if you've never watched it, that really kind of delves into that, specifically the development mindset. But just beginning to unravel a lot of the ways that we talk and the ways that we relate to origin communities, to the communities that are our partners in this business, is a really, really important step.
I think that's one of the silver linings, like with all of the devastation that we think about with COVID, obviously, and of course, too, all that we know about Black Lives Matter and the marginalization of Black people and BIPOC. But that, you know, we're in a moment where people are having kinds of conversations that we maybe haven't had in the past, or definitely haven't had in the past. And so how do we keep bringing forth these issues that may have in the past seemed like, oh, we can't talk about that, but now we must talk about these things. And I think that's really what's exciting in terms of, you know, we cannot go back to how things were pre-COVID, obviously, for many, many reasons. And then now we have a say as this sector, and inviting people in to have a conversation about what do we see different that can be possible now that wasn't ever going to be possible back in early March.
Yeah, but it raises the question for me of, what does coffee sourcing culture become? Because, you know, speaking to that, Shauna and Charlie, like, we have this image in our mind of the, you know, the walking through these forests and the machetes and the, like, you know, going to the remote corners of the earth, and the pictures of sourcing, of people who do work in sourcing, and like the centering of the person doing that sourcing. And obviously now we're all email jockeys. Everyone's buying coffee the way that it was bought for hundreds of years before this idea of the rogue coffee buyer existed. So what does it mean for us to take this moment and shift the way that we think about the culture of sourcing? And speaking to Jen's point, how does that shift open the gates for people for whom that hasn't been a possibility for one reason or the other? Like, there are lots of people who can't do this kind of travel. There are lots of people who aren't interested in this kind of travel, who would be just as capable. And there are lots of stories and lots of coffees that can find our way to us without us feeling like we have to discover them so we can pull the sword out of the rock. Like what does this look like for coffee sourcing as a culture going forward?
Meister, if I can speak from kind of two different perspectives that I've occupied in this industry. One from the roaster retailer, also as a trader at a specialty green importer, because I worked for one for over 8 years in between the two positions I've had at Colectivo. And I think you raise an important question, and that's really something that I've noticed and that I've thought a lot about over the past decade, is the role of the importer and how that was kind of marginalized, for lack of a better word, and kind of looked down upon. The whole direct trade movement was very interesting to watch from the importer perspective. And now that I'm back in a roaster retailer position, to continue seeing how it's evolved. I feel like what you just said, how do we make those connections happen? Importers and exporters were the ones who made those relationships exist in the first place and built those supply chains, and who do all the work to get those coffees in. And I feel like, there was this whole movement to get rid of the quote unquote middle people, which was, for me personally, enraging on so many levels. Because it's like those coffees just don't magically fall from the sky. So that's just my opinion. But, I feel like, especially now that no one's traveling to origin, we need to work through the supply chains that exist, or develop networks that are out there to get these coffees, and to they need to move from point A to point B to point C somehow. And I think the sort of traditional supply chain, if you will, exists for a reason. And I think even now more so than ever, we need to rely on that, because I can't go anywhere, nor do I really want to right now. And so I'm relying on the importers, not that I wasn't before, but I'm in much more frequent contact with them now than I might have been 6 months ago.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jen.
Yeah. So I wrote down a couple of things that I wanted to speak to, and I started roasting in 2005, right? And I've always been a roaster. I was a barista in '96 for 2 years. I was a really terrible barista. So I didn't know how to back flush a machine. It broke all the time. I'm that kind of barista, right? So so as somebody who's been a roaster my entire career with 3 different companies, and then working for an importer actually for a while, doing roasting education with them, and then now starting my own company, right? It's I am a person who was, before I got into coffee, traveled extensively. I speak Spanish. I've been all over the world on my own volition. And I constantly wanted to be a green buyer and was consistently denied any opportunity to do green buying with any company I worked with. So for whatever reason, right? Convenience, let's say. But it wasn't until I had to do it on my own as an individual that was invested. I paid for myself to become an international observer with Cup of Excellence. That was the first time I was able to even go. I mean, I've actually been on a coffee farm before I was in coffee, because I was on a hike through the mountains in Guatemala, because we were touring where the genocide happened in the 80s and what had happened to those communities. And, noticing that there was 2 old men and all the young boys were so young. And I remember walking through a coffee farm. That was my first coffee farm experience, So I don't know. So it's I feel one, starting your own business is the best way to become a coffee buyer. So I encourage all of you to just start your own business. But another thing that I wanted to say was that, I wrote down projects, because Shauna, you mentioned like projects and like how like, we feel like we're involved in these projects and like, what does that mean? And I was like, yeah, like project one sounds like very like arts and craftsy. It sounds very like charitable. And like, really, if you were working with a group of farmers or with a producer that wanted to work on something and they ask you for cash, because let's be honest, like cash is king, right? Like cold hard cash that's the best agency you can give somebody. If you want to help somebody in their life, make their life better, give them more money, pay them more, right? Pay them more for cherry, pay them more for green, whatever it is. But I was thinking like on specific projects, like really, like, why not just call yourself like an investor in the project? Like you don't own it. You're not building the wet mill, like you're not actually there doing the work, you're just giving money. Like you're just an investor. Like I kind of feel like, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, so the approach that I landed on, or that my team and I kind of landed on at Stumptown, was that any origin investment, and that is what we call them, that we make is led by origin, and it's a co-investment. So not equal, but it's an idea that comes from the community. They want it, and they are leading it and asking for our contribution and participation in it in some way. So their contribution can be money or labor or whatever it is, but it's a co-investment led by origin, and that's a good formula for any type of investment anywhere. Is the people who you invest in someone who like is excited to do something and has some skin in the game. But it was the way that I could see that would begin to be different from the way things have been done.
Right. And the language is so important, because, like the way you're like, we've been asked to invest in this project. We are going to help fund it, but it's not like, in a way, if it's like, we have this project, we are helping that, like, it's not a charitable white savior gesture, like, and I think that talking about becoming a co-investor on something, is really great, because like a company like a Stumptown or whatever company would only invest with people who are of like equal integrity to them, not like they don't know what to do, so we're gonna build this mill. Like I think it's just it's about language and how we use it, right? And so I think that's fantastic.
And also
you guys are doing that.
Being inclusive in terms of who gets to say what the project is. So often we see that, most cooperatives leadership, for example, is male dominated. And so of course the projects are going to be in line with a certain perspective that brings. And so, really wanting to make sure that from an equity perspective, that projects are really making sure they take into account the needs of the community and are really co-created with everyone in that community, all the different stakeholders.
And someone makes an interesting point in the chat as well, which is the idea that the investment comes from the company out of their own equity, not building it into the price of a coffee, which makes that investment, that idea of an investment, very murky and really shifts the responsibility of the relationship, shifts the risk in a way that doesn't seem like it embodies the word partnership that we use pretty much constantly. And the idea too of using this language, the investment language and the partnership language as part of our marketing, sort of leads me into this other question that I kind of wanted to explore with you all, which is that we know, I think everyone here knows, that when we talk about sourcing, like Al said before, we don't just mean cupping a coffee, deciding we like it, and writing a check for a contract. Like there's so many things that go into sourcing, including the building and maintaining of relationships, relationships over time, the kinds of images and the kinds of language that we use, and who is in control of what that part of the transaction, how that happens and how that gets shared. And so I kind of wanted to open that up and say, like, well, especially in a time where, first of all, we're all under extreme pressure to sell in a different way, in an urgent way, where, you know, there's this matter of surviving as businesses. Secondly, we're completely disconnected from the supply streams that we have normally been, you know, participating in. We're not visiting anybody. We're not taking our own pictures or, you know, following our own brand guidelines for like what images and what language do we use here. So how are you all managing kind of the other parts, the holistic parts of sourcing? Like, how has this whole moment really caused you to evaluate the other areas that aren't just related to literal contracts and the actual coffee product itself?
Well, I mean, from my experience so far, what Al was saying earlier about that sort of period in early specialty where the cowboy coffee buyer was trying to erase the middleman, you know, from the story. I think that, you know, speaking for Royal in this case, one of the adaptations that we've had to make during COVID is that we've had to close our own cafe. Like, we have a tasting room that operates in Oakland that is also like, it's a, you know, SCA certified laboratory. We do a lot of roasting education. There are seminars. It's very sort of cross-functional as well, in that like professionals outside of coffee have come to do tastings and instructionals and things like that. So we did have a resource that we would fill with bodies, transmit information, and we had a staff that was responsible for that, you know. And now, you know, since that location hasn't been able to stay open, in order to keep everybody on the payroll and keep them gainfully employed, we basically took all of the labor from that location and folded it into the trading of information at the business, you know, because it's like, especially if you're an importer, and not all importers work this way, to be clear, and I think everyone on this panel certainly knows that, but Royal is unique in that we are a very small team. We're an independent, you know, family business, and we also carry a deep inventory, which means that we take positions on coffees that we think need to be into the marketplace or deserve to be in the marketplace. And we sort of fill that diversity of inventory through our own sourcing efforts. So in some ways, while Royal has to sort of work as a trader doing back-to-back business with lots and lots of roasters, Royal at the same time operates like a buyer for a roastery would, in that we have, you know, deep relationships and certain like funding initiatives and marketing initiatives that are sort of uniquely Royals. And it's our responsibility to sort of make those coffees understandable to roasters who may not have that access themselves, right? So all that is to say that, like, how that's looking during COVID is, you know, all of the baristas and the retail staff from our roasting and showroom have actually been put to work interviewing Royal supplier connections in order to better democratize the kind of information that's available online. Like, we don't just trade physical coffee, and we certainly don't just trade paper, right? Like, what we're doing is we're trading information, and I think there is a kind of democratization that happens now when nobody can travel and everybody is sort of confined to either the existing relationships that they've built, you know, which hopefully are serving roasters nowadays, you know, better than they expected they would need to, because they have to really rely on those to keep, you know, the coffee flowing consistently. But, you know, for someone who is a smaller business and doesn't have the means necessarily to have a full-time traveling coffee buyer or to be at Origin 12 months out of the year, it's like their access should by no means diminish. And I think that's the sort of value that an importer should be looking to bring, especially now. I think in some way, like what Al was saying, it was kind of always there. Like, Al talking about Atlas made me remember this time in 2013 when I was working for a really small coffee roaster in Los Angeles, and we had bought some coffees from Atlas, and I reached out to Atlas because I was looking for an explanation as to why this particular coffee from Honduras still tasted so amazing at the end of the year. And I was like, hey, any sort of guidance here would be helpful. You know, like I feel like I need to explain to our coffee drinkers why this is unique, why the shelf life here is unique. And the answer that I got, I remember we put onto the website and we quoted the buyer at Atlas, and he emailed me back and he was kind of like, yo, normally, he was like, you didn't have to do that, you know? And I was like, well, you are the answer. Like, I don't get information if not from you. I need your interpretation because I wasn't there. And therefore you deserve credit for that interpretation. And I think it was almost like this kind of taboo move, I think, during this time where even the importers expected to really never get credit. So I think that what COVID is doing to that scenario is sort of bringing the importer back in the conversation a little bit, you know?
More than a little bit.
Yeah. And I think, you know, Royal's always been the type of importer that engages a little bit more in that than others might, because we carry an inventory, because we're really investing a lot in education that is roaster facing. And I think now more than ever, we're needing to put our resources into that effort. And I do see, like, when I go on our website, I see coffees that maybe didn't have the kind of like analytical depth, you know, than others before. Suddenly it's like they kind of look the same. They have the same kind of status, and you might have like an 83 coffee with a really amazing analysis next to an 85. And it's like, well, if you're a buyer and you're looking online and you need to fill your inventory with something, those coffees suddenly look pretty even, you know, and it can democratize the sales pipeline for certain producers. And, you know, I definitely believe in that.
What do you think, Al? I would love your perspective too on like the other things around, again, because like Charlie, you have experience, and like Jen, and Shauna, actually all of us have experience working for both roasters and importers. That's kind of funny. But there is a very different way of approaching the other things outside of sourcing, right? Like I'm sure that you are doing your job as a green buyer for a roaster very differently than you did when you were working for an importer. Like how do all of these other trappings of sourcing, how have they changed for you? And, you know, what kind of adaptations are you making for the Colectivo in terms of the relationships, how you're sharing the information about those relationships and things like that?
You know, actually, thanks for asking, Meister. I actually don't feel like we made a lot of changes or had to, because we have a number of supply chains that have been in place for quite a while. The longest is now 21, 22 years with a fair trade co-op in Chiapas. And when I came back to the company from Atlas, I brought some relationships over, and then there were others that were already well entrenched that I just have maintained. So really haven't had to do a whole lot over the past 4 or 5 months to you know, in response to what's been going on. You know, I think it ultimately just comes down to selling. How do we move the coffee that we had already contracted? Now we're talking about new crop contracts, trying to project how much we're going to use. Our business is both wholesale and retail. We don't know what's going to happen with COVID. We operate in 3 markets in 2 different states, Wisconsin and Illinois. You know, just trying to keep track of what's going on in each municipality where we have a cafe is in its own right exhausting. But just in terms of sourcing, you know, I think what I'm trying to do is just maintain the relationships and supply chains that we have. You know, maybe even buying a little bit of coffee, like more coffee than we need, really, just to keep those supply chains going. You know, because I think it's one thing I've had to think about is as challenging as it is for us on the buying side, on the consuming side, with what's been going on, it's so much worse at origin. And, you know, the New York Times did an amazing story recently about what's happening in Colombia And if you haven't seen this article, it's worth looking for, because it breaks your heart, to read about what's happening in a country that a lot of us have visited and know pretty well and have friends living in. We've met through coffee. And so, if we buy 100 bags of, let's say, Fair Trade Organic Peru from our relationship partner there that we don't really need because we already have enough coffee in that category, I'm gonna do it. I guess I'm going on record, saying that. And I'll figure out a way to use it, because I want to keep that relationship going. And, it's going to be a drop in the bucket, but I really do feel for producers and exporters, because what's happening at origin, from what we're hearing and reading, they don't have the same social safety networks that we do. They don't have the same healthcare systems and access that we do. The economies are not as developed, they're very fragile. It's just, things are so much worse. And I think I've had to remind myself that, just keep these relationships going, be in contact with producers, maybe buy a little bit more than I really need to, not too much, of course, because we still need to move that coffee. But, we're all in this together, which sounds really cheesy and canned, but I think really now more than ever is when we realize and we treasure the connectivity that the specialty industry has become and has fostered and continues to offer. And I'm hopeful that we'll all get out of this and go back to quote unquote normal at some point. But when the chips are down, especially at origin, that's equitable sourcing, I guess, in this sense, is just continuing to buy to the best of our abilities and just keep these relationships going, even if it's, half or third of what it used to be. And to pay the prices, that we were paying before, and not, again, it's each company is different and we're all struggling. And I don't want to say, oh yeah, just buy, for the same prices, because that's not the reality for a lot of roasters, but to really just do the best we can do.
And I think it's important also, to the degree that we can, keep in mind the gendered impacts of COVID on these communities and on these supply chains, and how might we be able to adjust for those? I think, this is one of the things that we confronted when COVID started was, oh my gosh, does anybody care about gender equity anymore? And if they do care about gender equity, what can we do about it? And I think it can be one of those issues that gets brushed to the side. And at the same time, we know that in any crisis, women and marginalized populations are even impacted in a much greater way, in a much more devastating way. And so yeah, I think we also need to keep the gender dynamic in mind as we have conversations, not necessarily putting extra burden on farmer organizations, but also asking questions. Like, this is a time to ask questions. This is a time to let our supplier partners know that we care about these other issues as well. And as much we want to continue to support them, continue to buy coffee, and also make sure that as much as possible the benefits are shared in an equitable way in those communities and within the households as possible.
And the only way to do that, what Kimberly's saying, is to go back to what Al was saying. You have to have consistency and commitment. And I really want to underscore the importance of that. I don't want anyone to underestimate the tremendous importance of that. We actually had some research done in Tolima, Colombia, with a group called El Jordan that we've worked with sometimes worked with for many years, about 12 years now. And it was an impact study, and it was from the perspective of the producer. We had all the producers interviewed and with very open-ended questions. And the results were interesting, and they really underscore Al's point of like what actually creates a positive impact at origin, what creates a positive economic impact, what creates a stabilizing force in communities. It is consistency over time, stable pricing, and consistency, stable, good pricing, consistency over time. That's a long-term commitment. And then growth. If you are a company that can grow, that's great. And so knowing that that is what generates impact, it's not rocket science if you think about it. Like if you've got a stable income and if you know that you can count on it, you're more willing to make investments. You're more willing to invest in your community, in your farm, in your children. And that is what a buyer and a roaster can do now, is being consistent as much as possible. And yeah, I'll also mention, like, even if you can't buy the same amount this year, or you have to change the mix, still give the business. And it's giving the business to the whole supply chain. So that's the other thing. There's always been an importer and an exporter, and either the estate or the smallholder association or the cooperative or whatever the production structure is on the ground. They're all there. And so when we're talking about engaging with importers or engaging with producers, it's engaging with the whole supply chain, really. And it always has. It's as Al said, it's funny to try to erase those to erase the people who are actually getting the coffee from point A to point B. That's never happened. They've always been there. And so it's engaging in the ways that we have now. First and foremost, with your business, with your business. And then also in Zoom calls and conference calls. I mean, we're doing a lot of that, almost on a weekly basis with a lot of our partners. And it's only when you're that engaged that you can do what Kimberly is talking about, like maintaining those relationships. We're maintaining those relationships the way that everyone's maintaining relationships right now, on Zoom calls and on in conference calls, and reaching out to people. It's still a dialogue. It's still a you can still be in communication. And now, I'm not trying to be too rosy about it, because there's a lot of difficulty and bad news, but now you do see the getting engaged, with communicating with producers at origin. Now that webinars like this and conversations like this are so mainstream, it's almost easier to do things like that, like to actually reach out and get on a Zoom call. And it's cool to do that and actually get the report out. Like what is actually happening? What's happening now in your community? Tell us what's happening in your community.
Yeah, I just want to quickly mention, the timing of COVID sort of hitting when it did in March. And, because I work for Royal, a lot of my answers are going to be sort of macro level, right? Because we work with hundreds of customers, and we have a lot of sort of therapeutic conversations with roasters of many different kinds. But COVID has disproportionately affected demand for Southern Hemisphere coffees, because COVID hit in the spring. And like a lot of roasting businesses, Royal as an importer, we had done, wrapped up about 80% of our annual buying by the time shelter in place hit and retail businesses started closing down, right? And fortunately, so far on that 80%, while we have accepted some coffee back from roasters, even after contract, in some cases after delivery, we've been able to absorb coffee that, due to falling demand, roasters haven't been able to accept, without pushing a single claim back on any of the producers that sold us that coffee in the first place. So we've been a kind of buffer, I think, between like a lapse in demand and a continuing supply on the origin side. You know what I mean? And it's good so far that has happened, but I think, and this is sort of purely intellectual at the moment, because we haven't actually seen this happening. Like, in fact, I think it seems like we're past the worst of it, because, the lull that sales took in sort of like March to May, we're starting to recover some of that and move more coffee. And our intake rate is about as high as it's been. But I think if coffee retail businesses continue to stay closed, if they can't open, or if their buying power is sort of, decapitated because people are staying home, then, what I see is that could threaten the demand and the full value of the really high quality coffees that roasters and importers would be buying during the second half of the year. Because the businesses that are thriving at the moment are sort of higher volume, slightly lower margin businesses, right? It's the grocery roasters, or it's the sort of widespread wholesalers. A lot of companies are figuring out how to go direct to consumer, and I think that's been a kind of lifeline, for a lot of small roasters that maybe didn't have that in place before. But unless cafes are opening up, I mean, consider what happens to like a 5-bag, $5 a pound lot if the only options are roasters roasting for grocery, trying to keep their efficiencies high, or their margins are so low that they can't afford to take a risk on this stuff. And it's like, if you're an importer, you are literally enabled by the combination of supply and demand, right? We can't buy 20 containers of really high priced coffee if nobody's going to buy it, because, especially when you have coffees that are really good and really expensive. So shelf life is, a huge issue. Like, you really want those coffees to find a home. And so I think, in a sense, and I don't want to sound like we're expecting this to happen, because I certainly don't. I think we'll recover. But what I'm certainly worried about is the lack of demand for the best coffees from Burundi and Rwanda and, second semester in Colombia and things like that. And it's like, we haven't been seeing that happening, but the way that COVID is shaping demand, like, that's where it's going to have an impact. A lot of the certified, like, full container coffees that are selling at low differentials, like, they're moving, like, they're doing well. But it's really like, what's going to happen to these unexchangeable coffees at the top, And I think that's what we're waiting to see for the second half of the year.
Charlie, if I can, that's such an interesting point. And that's happened, for us, we've had these coffees that we had contracted before COVID that were landing during the lockdowns, and then we're on the water. They've been landing over the summer. And I think one opportunity for roasters who are kind of in this position is to, sort of make proverbial lemonade out of these lemons. And we had an amazing Rwanda. We have it. We rolled it out a couple weeks ago, a few months after we originally had planned to. And we made it our monthly wholesale special for the very first time. So we had to discount it a bit, but we were able to promote it to wholesale accounts who I think largely wouldn't have even thought of it, wouldn't have considered it, because it's not in their wheelhouse. It's not a coffee they carry 12 months out of the year. It's not an origin they're familiar with. I think there's, at least, where we're located, a lot of unfamiliarity with newer origins like Rwanda. We're going to do the same thing with Burundi next month. And so what you're talking about is real. And we're really trying to figure out ways to move our higher end coffees that we normally would have sold through our cafes. But, I think what this is doing is we're putting coffees out to accounts, wholesale accounts, who may not have ever thought about these origins and tried these amazing coffees. It's a bit of a risk, but what can we do at this point? We have X number of bags sitting on the warehouse floor, and we got to move it. And these coffees deserve attention, and they deserve to be appreciated, especially now while they're still fresh.
Yeah,
I actually just want to hear from Jen real quickly, and then we've got one question in the chat. So I want to hear Jen's thoughts, and then this is me putting on my moderator hat. Sorry.
Well, I appreciate that. I took notes, and I also saw the question in the chat. So I'm a small business, very small, right? Like, when I buy a single origin coffee, it's 2 bags. And my business, what I think of as equitable sourcing, that was the question, right? Like, what is equitable sourcing? maybe to us.
I think that's the conversation.
The conversation, yeah. So for me, I want to buy coffees from producers that are low cost of production. And I would say the majority of specialty coffee that would probably be like low cost of production for producers would be anywhere between like, you know, the 84, 85, 86 point coffees. And that's really what I buy. And maybe I might get an 87 point coffee, but I'm not really looking for like luxury, like experimental, high cost of production coffees. And so what I'm looking, and then I want to pay as close to top dollar as I can for those coffees, right? So I want to pay a lot of money for coffee that is easy for producers to make. And what I do I'm lucky enough that I've been in the business for a long time, and I've roasted so many people's coffees, and I've met a lot of people at trade shows, that I just work with people that I trust. And one of the things that's really the most important to me is actually sort of mentioned in that question that's in the Q&A, is I want to know that when I pay, you know, $5, $6 for an 85 point coffee, that which I feel that I'm paying good money for. I'm paying good money, and I want to make sure that people are making good money, you know? So not just the producer, but everyone involved. And so I have to trust people like my friend Myra Powell, who has, you know, worked with her community project, and, you know, she's in Honduras, and she says that, you know, really, in order to be breaking even, people need to be making $2 an hour. And she offers full transparency that where I know that she's paying everybody at least $2.50, you know, and then on top of that, she'll tell me how much money goes towards everything, including logistics and bringing the coffee in, you know. And so I really feel that, you know, you have to have a lot of trust. And one of the things that are different now compared to 10 years ago is that so many more people are on social media and being able to use it. Like, you know, earlier Shauna was talking about having Zoom meetings with like producers, which is like fantastic. Like there's, I mean, I'm not saying it's 100, like everyone in the world has access to like any kind of like, you know, digital communications. I mean, not even in the United States does everyone have access. I mean, there's plenty of children in our school district who can't go to school, you know, if they don't have, you know, web access. So, but I think that it is much more improved, and it's really exciting to see that, like, not only could I promote somebody's coffee, but I could also give consumers that buy my coffee, I could give them the Instagram handle of the person I buy the coffee from, and they can like learn more in that producer's own voice about like the coffee that they grow and what kind of stuff they do and what they're working on and what, you know, what they think about specialty coffee even. But on top of that, I've been approached, which I think is really cool. I mean, I liked that Charlie also talked about like the spot market, and I think it's really important for importers to create and maintain a spot market for especially small roasters who don't have access to capital in order to buy a lot of coffee or bring in a container of coffee. Like we really need to be able to find coffees that we can put on our menus as customers hopefully come back, you know, all of our customers that have disappeared. But on top of that, like, I think I've been approached by a lot of different companies that seem to be like brand new, international companies that are trying to work on a digital platform that does transparency between farmers all the way to the consumer, you know, like farmer, roaster, consumer. And it's really cool when I was approached by one, because a lot of times roasters feel like they own that space. You know, they're like, let me introduce you to my producer, you know, like, you know, let me bring you along, coffee drinker, and I will introduce you to my friend and partner. But what I liked about this one platform is like I was just also a profile. Like there was a farmer profile, and then there would also be a roaster profile. So I thought that that was really fantastic. It's like, yeah, you're just a cog too, Apodaca, you know? So I don't know. I think that there's a lot of really cool creative stuff that is being developed and coming out there that will really help us along with this sort of like ideas of transparency and like, where does the money really go?
Awesome.
So I know we're really at our official finish time. It went by quick. I wanted to see if I hope everybody on our in our salon here, maybe we could stay on for a few minutes and open it up. So maybe close the official part. And if anybody can hang around of our salon attendees and our guests, maybe just open up the microphone even and have a little bit of a meet and greet just for a few minutes. And yeah, so I want to thank everybody for joining. And Meister, thank you so much for your fabulous role as the host of our salon here, and to everybody who joined us, all of our panelists. Well, we're not panelists because we're salon guests. So we really hope that everybody who's attended is enjoying